Today, I will rock you, sock you, pick you up, and drop you. I'm going to show you the key results of 22 of the most famous clinical trials in multiple sclerosis research ever done. These are pivotal trials, phase 3 trials, leading to FDA or EMA approval of drugs. And I actually got this from an article about something else, thinking outside the box, non-canonical targets in multiple sclerosis. I give credit to first author, Dr. Laura Bierhansel. This is actually an article about non-traditional drug targets, such as non-immunological drugs or drugs that target Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors, really looking at the future of multiple sclerosis research. But they have this amazing table with references of FDA, EMA approved drugs showing the key results. And I looked through all these citations, and I'm going to use the magic of video editing to show you the key results in graphical form. And you'll see some incredible trends. By the way, you can skip ahead using the links above or below. And you can see there are really some changes. We'll start with Betaseron, FDA approved in 1993, the first ever approved drug, and we go all the way to Ponvory, FDA approved in 2021. And you'll see a couple of things. One thing is that initially there were only placebo-controlled trials, a drug versus placebo. Later on, you'll see some active comparator trials where you'll look at a drug versus another effective drug to see which one is better. Initially, it's only relapsing, remitting multiple sclerosis trials. Later on, you'll see there are more and more progressive multiple sclerosis trials, and you'll see some change in the outcomes of the study. Initially, the only outcome they cared about was relapses, and then as a secondary outcome, they would have things such as lesions on MRI scan, but later on we see disability progression as an outcome, particularly in progressive MS trials. And there have been other changes in the methodology. But let's start off from the top. So Betaseron or beta interferon 1b, this is an injection given every other day. It's kind of crazy to think that there was a time when this drug was first approved and there wasn't enough of the drug to go around. Many people with MS were desperate to get it, and there was actually a lottery in the United States, and you had to get lucky to get the drug for the first few years. Of course, this drug has some pretty unpleasant side effects. You have to inject it yourself. It can cause fever and flu-like symptoms, and it can be pretty lousy, but at the time, it was really considered a major revolution. Previous to Betaseron, MS doctors did use things like monthly Solumedrol, which is really unproven in the long term, or other drugs such as cyclophosphamide, which seemed to be effective but had significant toxicity. So this was a relatively safe drug, didn't significantly increase the risk of infections, could be used long term, and so it really was revolutionary for its time. And so it was in a randomized controlled trial, and the lower dose was essentially ineffective, reducing relapses by only 7%. The higher dose reduced relapses by 33% and increased the proportion of people who had 0 relapses during the study by 50%. So half as many people had some relapses compared to placebo. So that was pretty impressive for its time. Next, we'll move to copolymer 1, known as glutarimer acetate. This is drugs like Copaxone, which was the actual formulation used in the study, and there are other formulations currently such as Glatopa, and it reduced relapses by 29%, and was thought to be approximately equally effective compared to beta interferons. For whatever reason, beta interferons have better data for actually preventing disability progression, whereas glutarimer acetate does not, so arguably beta interferons are a little bit better. The next drug is Avenex, intramuscular beta interferon 1a. So this is a little bit of a different formulation. So interferons are proteins that are released by the liver in response to viral infections. It turns out that beta interferon 1a actually has the sugar side chain and is more comparable to native interferons. It's made from hamster ovary cells, but it's kind of similar to what your liver produces. But it turns out they have very similar biologic effects, and other studies, which I'm not going to show here, actually compared Betaseron and Rebif, and they were approximately equally effective. But this was actually a study on Avenex, which is a once-a-week formulation, and they looked at a couple different things. This is a randomized trial on relapsing multiple sclerosis against placebo, and they looked at the proportion of individuals with disability progression at the end of the study, which is 104 weeks, and it was reduced by 37%. It also reduced relapses by a roughly equal proportion, as did Betaseron. Now, subsequent studies found that Betaseron is better than Avenex. However, that wasn't so obvious at the time. So there was this thought that high-dose, high-frequency interferons such as Betaseron, Rebif, and Xtavia and Betaseron are actually the same drug, were better than Avenex. And that ends up being true, and you'll see that later on, drug companies started comparing their drug against Avenex because they thought Avenex was the worst drug. Now we move on to Rebif, which is the exact same drug as Avenex, beta interferon 1A, but it's given subcutaneously under the skin 3 times a week. So it's very similar to drugs such as Betaseron. This was the PRISM study, and they found that they reduced the number of relapses compared to placebo by 27% if you were looking at the 22 microgram dose, and 33% if you were looking at the 44 microgram dose, which is the standard dose that's used today in people with multiple sclerosis. Subsequent studies found that Rebif and Betaseron are approximately equally effective. Now we move to the drug Novantrone. Now, Novantrone is no longer actually used in multiple sclerosis. The reason for this is just because of the terrible side effect profile. It can cause heart failure with long-term use. It suppresses the immune system. It can also cause a unique form of cancer called promyelocytic leukemia, occurring in about 1% of people, which can be fatal. I've never actually prescribed this drug in my life, but it is actually highly effective. And you could say it was really the first FDA-approved, highly effective disease-modifying therapy in multiple sclerosis. One of my colleagues, who's significantly older than me, she had a patient with bad relapsing MS who was doing poorly on other therapies, prescribed her this drug, and she turned around and did really well and was stable many years, even decades later. And this doctor would actually receive a Christmas card from this patient because she was so pleased that the doctor was willing to try anything, even this dangerous treatment, to try to help her. And in this case, it was highly effective. One of my other colleagues, I won't mention the name, she works at USC, she had a patient who actually died of complications of promyelocytic leukemia after receiving these drugs, which was actually prescribed by a different doctor, but she cared for the patient afterwards. So these side effects are no joke. Now, in this study, and this was interestingly a randomized controlled trial against placebo, and you could have relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis or secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. And they looked at a bunch of different things, but the key outcome was time to first treated relapse, and it was only reduced by 30%, which is really unusual. I'm not sure why it looks so bad in the study. This is actually a highly effective drug with incredible evidence for suppression of new MRI lesions. Now we move to the next highly effective drug, which is Tysabri Natalizumab. Now, this drug was the first highly effective disease-modifying therapy in multiple sclerosis that was actually safe enough for routine use. Now, Tysabri is a once-a-month infusion, and it works by blocking the immune cells from getting into the central nervous system. Unfortunately, there is a small risk of a severe infection of the brain caused by the JC virus called PML, or progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy. However, there is a blood test called the JC virus antibody that can help to assess the risk of that infection, and in many people the risk is very low. I won't go into the details in this video, but the point is there are many people who have taken this drug for a long period of time that tolerate it very well with relatively low risk, and in my opinion, particularly during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, this has had a very good risk to benefit ratio in people who are negative for the JC virus antibody. And so there are a couple of studies I'm going to show, or actually I'll just show one. This was actually a randomized controlled trial against placebo in relapsing MS, and it reduced relapses at 1 year by 68%, and it also reduced disability progression at 2 years by 42%. So if you think about that 68% reduction in relapses, that's much better than the older drugs like Betaseron and Copaxone that were reducing relapses by about a third. This drug was originally FDA approved in 2005, and there were 2 cases of people who got PML, and it was actually pulled from the market, but it was later put back on the market in 2006 with a monitoring program called the TOUCH program. So if you want this drug, you now have to fill out some paperwork acknowledging that you are aware of the risk of PML. And at that time, we didn't have a JC virus antibody, so there was really no way to assess risk. And a lot of people, like Dr. Stiner from Stanford, were really against this drug, saying, hey, reduction in relapses is just not worth the risk of PML. Now, I think it's very different, given that we're able to more appropriately give it to people who are at very low risk. Next, we move to the first pill approved for multiple sclerosis, which is Gilenya or fingolimod. This medication is an S1P receptor modulator that blocks lymphocytes from exiting the lymph nodes and getting into the central nervous system. And this was very exciting because people hated the injections. They wanted a pill to be available for MS, and I'll show you a couple of different studies. The first is the Freedoms trial in relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, which was just Gilenya versus placebo, and they studied a couple of different doses. One was the 1.25 milligram dose, and one was the 0.5 milligram dose. The higher dose, the 1.25 milligram dose, was later abandoned because it didn't significantly increase efficacy, and there were a few people who got disseminated shingles as a side effect, so it was thought it was kind of overdosed. But in this study, it reduced relapses versus placebo by 60% with the 1.25 milligram dose and 55% with the 0.5 milligram dose. In other words, roughly the same. Now, the reason there are multiple trials where one trial shows Gilenya versus placebo, and the other trial, the Transforms trial, shows it against an active comparator, is because the FDA and EMA are different organizations, and the EMA requires an active comparator if there are other drugs on the market to treat that condition. So the EMA is kind of more strict in a sense than the FDA. Not that they want the drug to be safer or more effective, they just want you to compare it to something else if there is another drug on the market, and this makes a lot of sense to me. So they thought that Avenex was the least effective multiple sclerosis disease modifying therapy, which is most likely true, and so they actually compared it against Avenex. Also, this was practical to some extent because, Avenex is a once weekly injection. It would be hard to give the placebo group a once daily injection with a drug like Copaxone. In other words, if you get randomized to Gilenya, it would suck to have to take a pill every day and an injection every day. So they made the placebo a little bit easier for the people who are randomized to the actual drug Gilenya. So in this drug, they showed that with the 1.25 milligram dose, it reduced relapses 50% versus Avenex. So they're further reducing relapses in people taking an effective drug, and by 48% with the 0.5 milligram dose. So a pretty significant reduction in relapses, even compared to people taking an effective drug. So this was very impressive. Of course, Gilenya is much riskier than Avenex. There is a risk of first dose bradycardia, reduction of the heart rate. There's also a risk of shingles and other infections, including rare cases of PML, although the risk is extremely low, approximately 1 in 20,000. This drug is also associated with greater probability of severe COVID-19. Next, we move to a different pill. There was one more study called Freedoms 2, which is another randomized trial against placebo, which essentially showed the exact same thing. I actually misstated the data before. So in the Transform study that was against Avenex, the 0.5 milligram dose showed a 52% reduction versus Avenex. In this second randomized controlled trial, Freedoms 2, it was a 48% reduction with the 0.5 milligram dose. Anyways, we move on to another pill for MS, cladribine or Mavenclad. This drug is kind of like a chemotherapy type drug. It has a very complicated dosing regimen. I have a separate video on it if you want to take a look. But it was studied against placebo in this randomized controlled trial, and it reduced relapses by 58% with the 3.5 milligrams per kilogram dose, and by 55% with the 5.25 milligrams per kilogram dose. So it's also a moderately highly effective therapy, perhaps not as effective as drugs such as Tysabri and Ocrevus. But it has the benefit of being an induction therapy where some people will achieve long-term remission after 2 years of treatment and may not require additional treatment. Next, we move to another pill for multiple sclerosis, which is Aubagio or Terraflunamide. This is a once-a-day pill that is generally well tolerated, though it can cause symptoms such as gastrointestinal upset and hair loss, and it could also cause birth defects. So it does have some limitations when treating a disease that affects a lot of young women of childbearing age. And I'll show you a couple of different studies. The first is the Temso study in relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, showing Aubagio versus placebo. And they studied 2 doses. One was the 7 milligram dose, and the other was the 14 milligram dose. Typically, doctors will prescribe the 14 milligram dose because it's a little bit more effective, but the 7 milligram dose was also effective, so they just went ahead and approved both doses. And for the 7 milligram dose, it reduced relapses by 31%, and for the 14 milligram dose, it was by 32%, though other metrics suggest that the 14 milligram dose is significantly more effective than the 7 milligram dose, most likely. So this drug is likely of comparable efficacy to some of the initial treatments, such as Betaseron and Copaxone, though with the convenience of a pill, though there are potentially more side effects, such as suppression of the immune system, although marginally, and affecting the liver, and monthly liver tests are recommended for the first 6 months of people taking this drug. Now, another thing we'll see here is a study in clinically isolated syndrome, CIS. This is people who had a single event of demyelination in the central nervous system, such as optic neuritis or transverse myelitis, but did not meet the full diagnostic criteria for multiple sclerosis. I won't explain the technical details, but the diagnostic criteria of multiple sclerosis have changed such that most of these people would actually meet the modern diagnostic criteria for multiple sclerosis. So CIS is actually not so common these days, and you don't see this term as often. But there was this thought that you shouldn't treat people with CIS, you should just watch them. But they were trying to prove, no, we should treat as early as possible, even in people who don't meet the full diagnostic criteria for multiple sclerosis. And they did, in fact, show that this is a good strategy. And they looked at time to relapse, or time to conversion to clinically definite multiple sclerosis. So in someone with CIS, if they had a new lesion on MRI or had a new relapse, they would then meet the diagnostic criteria for multiple sclerosis, and they were able to reduce this by 37.2% with the 7 milligram dose and by 42.6% with the 14 milligram dose, so it was definitely effective. There was another study, which was also a randomized controlled trial against placebo, which showed very similar results. This is called the Tower study, and the 7 milligram dose reduced relapses by 22%, the 14 milligram dose reduced relapses by 36%, and so again, the higher dose was more effective, but neither dose was highly effective compared to some of the other drugs that we talked about. Then the pill for multiple sclerosis, Tecfidera, or dimethylfumarate. Now, this was very exciting. This was very hyped when it came onto the market because people thought this drug is extremely safe. And it had been used for many years in the treatment of psoriasis in Europe in the formulation Fumaderm, which is monomethylfumarate, but it's very, very similar. And people thought this drug is going to be so safe and so effective that primary care doctors are going to prescribe it and people won't even need to see multiple sclerosis specialists anymore. Now, of course, that ended up not being the case, but this was a very, very hyped drug. And I'll show you the results. So the first study we'll look at is the CONFIRM study, which is in relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. And here they used an active comparator, again, to satisfy the needs of the EMA. You didn't need this for the FDA. And they used as the active comparator glatiramer acetate, or Copaxone, because they thought this drug was not as effective, probably based on the poor data in preventing disability progression. And they found that they reduced the relapse rate by 44% with the twice daily version, which is actually what's used today, and by 51% for the thrice or 3 times a day daily version. The form that actually is on the market is the twice daily version at 240 milligrams. And they compared it to placebo, so 44% is reduction versus placebo. Glatiramer acetate also beat placebo by 29%. There was no statistically significant difference between Tecfidera and Copaxone was the formulation of glatiramer acetate which was used in the study, but you can see there is a trend towards Tecfidera possibly being a little bit better. Now, there was one problem with this study where they actually didn't use what's called a double dummy. So normally when you do a randomized controlled trial, both people think they could be getting both treatments. So people taking Tecfidera, they take the pill and the shot, but the shot only contains saline. Whereas people taking Copaxone, they're taking the shot and then they're taking a placebo pill. They didn't want people randomized to Tecfidera to have to take a placebo because you had to do a shot once a day. And of course, that's very unpleasant if you're just taking a placebo. And so they actually didn't give them the placebo, and that potentially biased the study a little bit because people knew that they were getting the real drug. Okay, so anyway, the other study was just against placebo, and what they did is they just compared Tecfidera to placebo, and they looked at the proportion who had relapsed at least once by 2 years, and with the twice daily dose, it was reduced by 41%. With the thrice daily dose, it was 43%, not a significant difference, which is, of course, why we use the twice daily dose. Now, obviously, Tecfidera was not as effective as some people thought it would be. It's a modestly to moderately effective disease-modifying therapy, certainly not as effective as infusion-based therapies. And that moves us very nicely to Lemtrada. So this is perhaps the strongest disease-modifying therapy that is actually FDA approved. In my video looking at head-to-head trials of disease-modifying therapies in multiple sclerosis, I ranked hematopoietic stem cell transplant as likely the most effective, of course, depending on the conditioning regimen. And Lemtrada I rank number 2 because of the potential for long-term remission. Now, Lemtrada, or Alemtuzumab, is a drug which targets CD52, which is on the presence of all lymphocytes, so it depletes both B and T cells. There are a couple of problems with this. One is the risk of infections, and the other problem is as the B lymphocytes come back without T cell regulation, there's a risk of getting secondary autoimmune diseases. So some people will develop thyroid disease or even bleeding disorders or kidney disorders due to the drug. Now, of course, the investigators knew this, and they knew that this drug had to be really good if they were going to put it on the market. And there was actually a lot of debate about whether or not the FDA would actually approve it, and one of my former mentors thought that they really shouldn't approve this drug. He was more conservative. He thought a lot of his patients did pretty well. He didn't really want to take this kind of risk. So anyways, they studied this drug against a relatively good drug, which was Rebif. Now, of course, Rebif doesn't seem that good to us now, but at the time, people thought it's a high-dose, high-frequency interferon. It's relatively good. And in fact, Lemtrada destroyed Rebif in both of these trials. So in the first trial, the CAM trial, they looked at the proportion of people with sustained accumulation of disability, and it reduced it by 66%. Again, this is versus Rebif, not versus a placebo, and it reduced relapses by 72%. In the second trial, the CARE-MS1 study, they reduced the relapse versus Rebif by 55%, and the proportion with sustained accumulation of disability by 27%. So not all that impressive, but again, this is versus another drug with proven activity. That's a lot better than comparing a drug against placebo. And so today, Lemtrada is known to be one of the most effective disease-modifying therapies with multiple sclerosis, though with more risk than many alternatives. Next, we move on to the first Me Too drug. So this is another trend which I think is somewhat disappointing, where instead of taking the risk of coming up with a totally new drug that has a different mechanism of action, like, say, ATA188, which targets Epstein-Barr virus, or the Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors, this is a drug which is very similar to an existing drug, which is Siponimod or Mayzent, which is very similar to Gilenya. It's also an S1P receptor modulator. Now, Mayzent is a little bit different in that it is more selective towards the S1P1 subreceptor. However, that doesn't necessarily change the safety or efficacy. One potential benefit of Mayzent is that you may not actually need to do a first dose observation because of the risk of first dose bradycardia or slowing of the heart rate. Anyways, what's unique about this particular study, though, is it's the first pill used to treat progressive multiple sclerosis. So I'm only going to show the study on secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. Of course, this drug is also approved for relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. Now, Gilenya already had a failed trial in progressive multiple sclerosis. So people weren't so optimistic about this. But the people in the study on Gilenya were somewhat older with a lower proportion of enhancing lesions. In other words, they had less inflammatory activity, so it was kind of less likely to be successful. In this study, the EXPAND study, they looked at individuals who are on average a little bit younger with more active lesions, and they were able to demonstrate a reduction in 3-month confirmed disability progression by 21%. This was a modest effect, but it was statistically significant. Next, we move to one of the most popular drugs used to treat multiple sclerosis today, which is Ocrevus. And it's used both for progressive multiple sclerosis and relapsing multiple sclerosis. And I actually participated in the OPERA study, which was the study in relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. And there were 2 studies, OPERA 1 and OPERA 2. And this was just a trial against an active comparator, which was Rebif. And again, they knew that this drug targets B lymphocytes, and it could potentially cause infusion reactions and infections, and so they knew it had to really beat an active comparator. And they did in fact show that it reduced the rate of relapses versus Rebif by 47%, and this was over a 2-year study. So it was definitely much better than high-dose, high-frequency interferons. And unlike Lemtrada, I think the side effect profile was much more palatable, which is why Ocrevus is much more commonly used than drugs such as Lemtrada, which a lot of neurologists would be somewhat uncomfortable with, and a lot of patients, of course, as well. The other study was the Oratorio Study, which was a placebo-controlled trial in primary progressive multiple sclerosis. So this is actually the first drug to show any evidence of efficacy in primary progressive multiple sclerosis. And there was a time that people thought PPMS was just untreatable. There's just not a lot of inflammatory activity. Maybe it's more of a neurodegenerative variant of the disease, but they demonstrated that that's not actually true. There are potential treatments. Now, this was not a highly effective treatment. They were only able to reduce the disability progression by 16%, so not a huge effect, but they were able to slow it down a little bit. And so this is sort of a first step, and hopefully we'll see better drugs with larger efficacy rates here to come. Next, we move on to a few other oral drugs, and again, we're seeing this trend towards Me Too drugs. So ozanimod, which is Zeposia, is another drug that's very similar to fingolimod or Gilenya. It's an S1P receptor modulator. It's a little bit different. And they actually had a randomized control trial against an active comparator, and they were able to reduce relapses by a further 50% with the 1 milligram dose and 31% with the 0.5 milligram dose. And the last study I'll show is Ponvory, and this was another randomized control trial of another S1P receptor modulator, and I believe this study was actually randomized against one of the other pills, which was Aubagio, and they were able to show that it was more effective, reducing relapses further by 31%. And so now it's very well known that drugs such as S1P receptor modulators such as Ponvory and Zeposia and Gilenya and Mayzent are just more effective than drugs such as Aubagio. And so we can really see this trend. We're seeing more and more comparator trials. Some people would argue that it's really unethical to randomize someone with multiple sclerosis, particularly a younger person with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, to a placebo. In certain countries, a lot of these drugs are not all that available, and so the ethics may be a little bit different there, but I tend to agree with that sentiment. We really shouldn't be giving placebo to people if there is an effective available drug. And hopefully we're seeing more and more efficacy. We have more options for highly effective drugs. And I think there is some trend towards safer highly effective drugs. I think Ocrevus is definitely safer compared to drugs such as Novantrone and Lemtrada and cyclophosphamide and many conditioning regimens such as in HSCT, for example. So hopefully we'll see a trend towards more utilization of highly effective drugs that have a better safety profile, and I'm definitely interested to see what the Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors can do. Now, where do we go from here? I think if we could look at a similar chart in 15 years, what we would see is a trend towards new targets, looking at things that are not immune targets. Targeting things such as Epstein-Barr virus with ATA-188. We may see very specific targets? Instead of depleting all lymphocytes, is there a way to interfere with their signaling, like with the Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors? Or are we sacrificing efficacy by being more selective? Right now, it's not really known, but I think we'll see a trend towards people taking multiple medications. Maybe they take an immunotherapy plus a neuroprotective agent, for example. But anyways, I hope you found this video to be useful. If you have any questions, or if you want a reference, or if you have a suggestion for a future video, please let me know. My name is Brandon Bieber. I make videos about multiple sclerosis every Wednesday, so subscribe and ring the bell if you want notifications.